Everything you have ever been told about success in the American West is a lie, specifically the part about size being the only measure of a man's worth. We have been conditioned to believe that the sprawling ranch house with the wraparound porch and the high vaulted ceilings is the ultimate symbol of dominion over the land, a testament that nature has been tamed and brought to heel. But the prairie does not care about your architecture, and the wind does not respect your square footage. In the winter of 1888, in the unforgiving expanse of the Dakota Territory, this lesson was not taught in a classroom or a church, but carved out of ice and regret across thousands of frozen miles. At the center of this lesson was a man named Hiram, an old-timer who had been ridiculed for years by the booming population of new settlers. While the newcomers were erecting two-story Victorians with drafty parlors and massive barns that echoed with emptiness, Hiram lived in a structure that barely qualified as a shed in the eyes of his neighbors. They called it the Gopher Hole or Hiram's Folly, a low-slung, unattractive mound of earth and timber that seemed to hug the ground in terror rather than stand tall in pride. The townspeople, flushed with the optimism of the land boom, would ride past Hiram's property on their way to Sunday service and point fingers wrapped in fine wool, laughing at the lack of ambition displayed by the old man. Thomas, a young rancher who had just completed a magnificent barn with a hayloft that touched the sky, was among the loudest of the critics. Thomas believed that a man's legacy was visible from a mile away, that if you didn't build big, you admitted defeat. He would stop his carriage, look at Hiram checking his humble fence line, and shout, "Hey Hiram, you planning to invite the chickens in for dinner? Or is that box just for you?" Hiram would never shout back, never explain, and never defend himself. He would simply tip his battered hat, his eyes obscured by the brim, and continue packing mud into the chinks of his walls, patting the earth with the affection one might show a prize horse. What Thomas and the others failed to understand was that Hiram wasn't building for the mild autumns or the green springs. He was building for the monster that slept in the north. They saw a hovel, he saw a fortress. They saw poverty, he saw physics. And the tragedy of their ignorance was that it would take a catastrophe to reveal the difference between a house built for vanity and a home built for survival. The catastrophe arrived on a Thursday in January, a day that began with a deceptive, unnatural warmth that lured men away from their hearths and cattle out of their pens. The sky was a bruised purple, innocent enough to the untrained eye, but to those who knew the rhythm of the plains, it was the color of a holding breath before a scream. Thomas was 3 miles out from his main house, inspecting the northern grazing limits, feeling the unseasonable thaw on his face and thinking about the expansion he planned for the spring. He was calculating lumber costs in his head, dreaming of a second wing for the main house, when the horizon simply vanished. It didn't fade. It was erased. A wall of white, pulverized ice moving faster than a locomotive, swept over the ridge. There was no transition, no warning breeze. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than an hour, plunging from a comfortable thaw into a lethal, lung-freezing cold that turned moisture to ice instantly. The wind hit with the force of a physical blow, knocking Thomas's horse sideways. The animal, blinded and panicked by the sudden sting of ice crystals that felt like ground glass, reared up, threw Thomas into a drift, and bolted into the blind whiteness. Thomas scrambled to his feet, shouting for the horse, but the sound of his own voice was ripped from his throat and scattered into the void. The visibility was zero, not poor, not low, but absolute zero. He could not see his own gloved hand when he held it out at arm's length. The world had shrunk to the space inside his coat. Panic, the great killer of the unprepared, surged through him. He spun around, trying to orient himself toward his magnificent ranch house, the one with the high gables and the big porch. He knew it was south or thought it was south, but in the whiteout, cardinal directions ceased to exist. He began to stumble forward, driven by the desperate image of his large stone fireplace. He thought of the high ceilings he was so proud of, the grand staircase, the sheer volume of air he owned. But out here, the cold was an intelligent, predatory thing. It found the gaps in his coat. It found the seams in his boots. His eyelashes froze together, sealing his eyes shut until he had to claw the ice away with numb fingers just to see the swirling nothingness. He was walking toward what he thought was safety, but he was actually walking deeper into the killing zone. After what felt like hours but might have been only 30 minutes, the cold began to do strange things to Thomas's mind. The shivering, which had been violent and uncontrollable, began to subside, replaced by a dangerous, creeping lethargy. This was the trap. His body was giving up the fight, pulling blood from his extremities to keep his heart beating. He stumbled, his boot catching on a buried root, and fell hard onto the ice-crusted snow. He lay there for a moment, the wind howling like a banshee over him, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming desire to just close his eyes. It would be so easy to sleep. But then, through the roar of the gale, he saw a faint, impossible shape. It wasn't the towering silhouette of his own barn. It was a hump, a low shadow barely rising above the drifts. It was the gopher hole. He had walked in a circle and ended up at the very place he had mocked. A bitter laugh tried to escape his throat but turned into a cough. He didn't want to die in a shed. His pride revolted against it. Not there, he thought. I need real shelter, but his legs refused to lift. The cold had shackled him. He realized with terrifying clarity that his big house, with all its space and grandeur, was miles away, and even if he reached it, the very size of it would be a liability in this wind. He had to crawl. He dragged himself through the snow, his pride stripping away with every inch of progress. The distance was no more than 50 yards, but it felt like a crossing of the Atlantic. He couldn't feel his feet anymore. He couldn't feel his hands. He was propelling himself with his elbows and knees, a broken creature seeking the earth. When he finally reached the rough-hewn timber wall of Hiram's cabin, he collapsed against it. He expected to feel wind whistling through the cracks, the way it did in his own large barn, but there was nothing. The wall was solid. It felt less like a wall and more like the side of a mountain. He blindly felt for the door, his hands clumsy blocks of meat. He found the latch, a heavy iron thing, and pushed. Nothing happened. Panic flared again. Was it locked? Was he going to die on the doorstep of the man he ridiculed? Then he remembered a detail he had laughed at months ago. Hiram's door didn't open outward. It opened inward. Thomas had mocked it as poor design. It eats up your floor space, old man. But now, with 3 feet of snow drifted against the outside, an outward opening door would have been sealed shut, a coffin lid. Because it opened inward, Thomas was able to fall into the room. He tumbled across the threshold and kicked the door shut behind him with the last reserve of his strength. The silence was instantaneous. It was heavy, thick, and startling. The screaming wind was cut off as if by a blade. But it wasn't the silence that shocked him. It was the heat. It didn't just feel warmer. It felt like he had been swallowed by a living lung. The air was dense and still. He lay on the floor, gasping, waiting for the shivers to return, waiting for the pain of the thaw. A shadow moved across the room. Not a frantic rush, but a slow, deliberate shuffle. A match flared, the smell of sulfur cutting through the scent of wood smoke and drying sage. An oil lamp sputtered to life, revealing the weathered, leather-map face of Hiram. The old man didn't look surprised. He didn't look vindicated. He just looked down at the shivering heap of arrogance on his floor, holding a tin cup of steaming broth. "Door opens in," Hiram said softly, his voice gravel and dust. "Wind can't pull it open. Snow can't push it shut. Basic mechanics, son. Drink this before you lose those toes." Thomas tried to sit up, but the room spun. As his vision cleared, he began to understand the genius of the space he was in. The cabin wasn't small because Hiram was poor. It was small because Hiram was brilliant. The ceiling was low, barely 6 inches above Hiram's hat, meaning there was no wasted space for the heat to rise into and vanish. In Thomas's house, the heat pooled 12 feet up in the rafters while his family froze at the dinner table. Here, the heat was forced down, wrapping around them like a blanket. The walls were not just wood. They were 2 feet thick, packed with sod and earth, a thermal mass that absorbed the heat of the stove during the day and radiated it back at night. There were no drafts, not one. The gopher hole was effectively a sealed capsule. a life support system designed for exactly one purpose: to keep a human being alive when the world outside wanted them dead. Thomas looked at the cast-iron stove in the center of the room. It wasn't a giant, roaring furnace like the one he had imported from the east. It was modest, efficient, and positioned so that it heated the entire room evenly. Every tool, every pot, every blanket was within arm's reach. "You laughed at the size," Hiram said, sitting on a low stool and feeding a single piece of hardwood into the stove. He didn't say it with malice, just a matter-of-fact observation. "But heat is like water, Thomas. It flows. If you give it too much room, it thins out until it's useless. You have to hold it. You have to respect it." Thomas couldn't speak. His teeth were chattering violently now as the blood rushed back to his core. He looked around the room, the shelves lined with dried meats, the tightly packed mud chinking that left no gap for the wind, the heavy wool blankets nailed over the single, small window. It was ugly by the standards of the town. It had no curb appeal. It had no grandeur. But in this moment, amidst the howling death of the great blizzard, it was the most beautiful piece of architecture Thomas had ever seen. He realized then that he had built a stage set for a life of leisure, while Hiram had built a machine for survival. The realization hit him harder than the cold. He had bet his life on appearances, and he was currently alive only because of the substance he had mocked. "My house," Thomas stammered, his voice weak. "The big fireplace." The windows. Hiram shook his head slowly, pouring more broth into the cup. "Pretty things," the old man admitted. "But a fireplace sucks the warm air out of a room to feed the fire. It's a pump that moves heat outside. And big windows, those are just holes in your armor, son. Just holes." Hiram leaned forward, his eyes catching the lamplight. "Out here, nature asks you a question every winter. It asks, do you want to look important, or do you want to be alive?" Most folks get the answer wrong because they think the storm is watching them. The storm isn't watching. The storm is just checking for cracks. Thomas closed his eyes, the warmth seeping into his bones, and for the first time in his life, he understood the difference between the illusion of power and the reality of competence. He was safe in the box he had ridiculed, while his mansion stood freezing and empty, a monument to a misunderstanding that almost cost him everything. The hours stretched into the night, and the blizzard outside transformed from a weather event into a siege. The wind did not merely blow. It hammered against the earth with a rhythmic, concussive force that vibrated through the soles of Thomas's boots. Inside the cabin, however, the sensation was disorienting. There was no rattling of window panes, no creaking of floorboards, none of the drafty whispers that plagued Thomas's large Victorian home during even a mild summer storm. The heavy sod walls, 3 feet thick and interlaced with the tough, fibrous roots of prairie grass, deadened the sound of the gale to a dull, distant roar, like a train passing miles away. Thomas sat on a crude bench, wrapped in a buffalo robe that Hiram had tossed him, watching the old man work. Hiram moved with an economy of motion that was almost hypnotic. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't pacing. He was simply maintaining the equilibrium of his survival machine. He adjusted the damper on the small cast-iron stove by a fraction of an inch, tuning the fire rather than feeding it, ensuring that every ounce of wood yielded its maximum potential in thermal energy. In Thomas's house, they burned cords of wood to keep a single parlor tepid. Here, Hiram was heating his entire world with a handful of split scrub oak. Thomas watched the smoke rise from the stovepipe, expecting it to be sucked out violently by the storm, but the draft was steady and controlled. "The wind is trying to pull the air out of the room," Hiram murmured, noticing Thomas's gaze. "It creates a vacuum. If your house isn't sealed tight, the storm sucks the heat right out through the cracks in your fancy siding. But mud doesn't crack. Dirt doesn't shrink." He tapped the wall beside him. "You called it a dirt pile, Thomas, but this is insulation. It breathes just enough to keep the air from going stale, but it holds the warmth like a stone in the sun. You were trying to fight the winter with timber and glass, things that get cold and stay cold. I work with the earth. The earth stays a constant temperature if you go deep enough." Thomas looked at the walls with new eyes. He realized that the ugliness he had mocked was actually a sophisticated adaptation to the environment. The low profile of the roof meant the wind slid over it like water over a smooth rock, finding no purchase, no flat surface to slam against. His own high-gabled barn was likely acting as a sail right now, taking the full brunt of the wind's fury, straining at every nail. Here, in the gopher hole, the physics were on their side. The cabin wasn't defying the storm, it was ducking under it. By the time the grandfather clock in Thomas's mind would have struck midnight, the reality of his near-death experience began to settle into a heavy, reflective silence. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a raw vulnerability. He looked at Hiram, who was whittling a small peg to repair a snowshoe, his face illuminated by the golden glow of the lantern. "How did you know?" Thomas asked, the question hanging in the warm air. "How did you know to build it like this? Everyone else. We all brought our plans from the east. We built what we knew." Hiram paused, his knife resting on the wood. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his eyes were old, filled with the memory of ghosts. "I didn't know, not at first," Hiram admitted, his voice low. 40 years ago, up in the territory, I built a cabin just like yours. High roof, big windows to see the mountains. I thought I was a king." He shaved a thin curl of wood onto the floor. "Then the '56 blizzard hit. I spent 3 days burning my furniture to keep my toes. I lost 2 dogs and the feeling in my left hand. I realized then that the land doesn't care about my memories of Ohio. The land dictates the architecture. If you don't listen, you leave." Hiram pointed the knife tip toward the dark corner of the room. "I learned that you don't build for the sunshine. You build for the worst day of the year. Every single day you build, you ask yourself, will this kill me in January? If the answer is maybe, you tear it down." Thomas felt a flush of shame that had nothing to do with the heat. He thought of his own expansion plans, the bay windows he had ordered from St. Louis, the high-ceilinged entryway meant to impress guests. He had been building a monument to his own ego, assuming that the prairie was just a backdrop for his success. He hadn't respected the lethality of the place he lived. He had treated the Dakotas like a tame garden, not a sleeping tiger. "I called you a fool," Thomas whispered, looking down at his hands, which were finally regaining their natural color. "I laughed at this place every time I rode by." Hiram shrugged, a gesture of profound indifference to public opinion. "You weren't laughing at me, son. You were laughing at what you didn't understand. Men often mistake flash for substance. It's the way of the world. But out here, nature is the final judge. And nature prefers the tortoise to the hare." The storm raged for 2 full days. In that time, the cabin became a capsule of suspended time. There was no day or night, only the rhythm of the stove and the periodic check of the ventilation. Thomas watched his food supplies, dried beef and biscuits, dwindle, but Hiram's supply was calculated with mathematical precision. There was no excess, but there was enough. The smallness of the space, which Thomas had once considered a sign of poverty, revealed itself as a masterclass in efficiency. Because the room was small, they didn't need to shout to be heard. Because the shelves were open and close, they didn't need to walk to get supplies, conserving calories. Because the sleeping alcove was elevated near the stovepipe, they slept in the warmest pocket of air. Every inch of the gopher hole had a function. There was no vanity footage. Thomas began to feel a strange comfort in the confinement. The walls felt like arms holding him, not a cage trapping him. He realized that the emptiness of his own large house was a source of anxiety he hadn't even recognized. The constant subconscious worry about filling the space, heating the space, maintaining the space. Here, life was distilled to its essentials: warmth, food, safety, company. On the morning of the 3rd day, the roaring stopped. It didn't taper off. It simply ceased, leaving a silence so profound it rang in their ears. Hiram stood up, his joints cracking, and moved to the door. "Time to dig," he said simply. This was the moment of truth for the inward opening door. If the door had swung outward, they would have been trapped, forced to tunnel out through the roof or wait for rescue that might never come. But Hiram simply lifted the latch and pulled. A wall of white snow, packed hard as concrete, stood in the frame. It didn't spill in, it was a solid block. Hiram picked up a short-handled shovel that had been leaning by the jam, waiting for this exact moment, and began to carve a tunnel. Thomas joined him, using a metal pan to clear the debris. They worked in tandem, the young man and the old, clearing a path through 10 feet of drift until they broke the surface. The light that flooded in was blinding, refracted by a billion ice crystals. They climbed out of the hole, emerging like miners from the deep earth, and stood on top of the snowpack. The world had been obliterated. Fences were gone. Roads were gone. The landscape was a smooth, white sheet under a brilliant, indifferent blue sky. Thomas shielded his eyes and looked south. He scanned the horizon for the familiar peaks of his ranch house. First, he saw nothing. Then he saw the chimney. Just the chimney. The rest of the house was buried up to the second-story eaves. And the great barn, the one with the hayloft that touched the sky, was a shattered ruin. The roof had collapsed under the sheer weight of the snow and the force of the wind, the structural integrity of the wide, open span failing exactly where Hiram had said it would. It was a crushing visual blow. His beautiful, expensive structures had buckled, while Hiram's humble mound, shaped by the wind rather than opposing it, sat completely undisturbed beneath the drifts. They walked on top of the hard-packed snow toward the town, or where the town used to be. Along the way, they found the cattle. Some were standing, frozen solid in groups, huddled against fences that had become traps. Others were buried. But near Hiram's property line, his small herd of hardy scrub cattle was alive, huddled in a natural ravine he had deepened and lined with straw, protected by a windbreak of planted heavy brush. He hadn't fought the wind. He had diverted it. When they finally reached the town center, the devastation was absolute. The modern buildings with their flat facades and plate glass windows were battered. Some roofs caved in, others filled with snow through shattered panes. People were emerging, pale and shaken, recounting stories of desperate cold, of burning grand pianos and dining chairs just to keep the frostbite at bay. When Thomas walked into the general store, which was serving as a makeshift triage center, the room went silent. They had assumed he was dead. He was known to be out on the ridge. He was known to rely on his big, drafty house. When they saw him, alive, warm, and frostbite-free, standing next to Hiram, the confusion was palpable. "Thomas?" the storekeep asked. "We thought. How did you survive out there?" "Your barn is flat." Thomas looked at the crowd, seeing the same judgment in their eyes that he had once held. He looked at Hiram, who was quietly buying a sack of flour in the corner, ignoring the attention. "I didn't survive," Thomas said, his voice steady and loud enough to reach the back of the room. "I was saved. And I was saved by the only man in this territory who knows how to build a house." He pointed a trembling finger at the old man. "We laughed at him. We called it a gopher hole. But while we were freezing in our palaces, he was sitting in his shirt sleeves drinking tea." He turned back to the men who had been his drinking companions, the ones who had joined him in mocking the old rancher. "We built for our egos," Thomas said, the lesson finally crystallizing into words. "He built for the truth. And the truth is, the cold doesn't care how rich you are. It only cares if you're prepared." The room was silent. Hiram finished his transaction, tipped his hat to the room, and walked out into the bright, cold sun. Thomas followed him. He didn't rebuild his barn that spring. Instead, he spent the season hauling sod and timber, asking Hiram to teach him the geometry of warmth, realizing that the most impressive thing a man can build isn't a castle that dominates the horizon, but a sanctuary that respects the storm.